Good morning. This is the pickup again of our Bible study. It's supposed to be at 10 o'clock. I had some trouble getting the technology working and getting it set up today, and so I don't have any live participants on the Zoom. It took me a while to get Zoom set up, which I've not had trouble with before, so I'm hoping that you can see me. If no Zoom participants join in, I'm going to turn the camera around, and then we'll just do the Bible study through the live stream instead of having to deal with the retransmission. Let's see. Oh, okay. So we've got some participants coming in. Hello.
Hello.
Hello. How are you? Sorry it took me so long to get it up today.
Sorry to hear about your mom.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. How's everybody doing?
I mean, I think we're doing well. It's hard to know. You know, all of the metrics, all the measurements that you would use don't apply. So, you know, I don't know. So, it was crazy. It was a crazy event. We were only able to go. We drove 3 hours to be able to stand 10 feet from her coffin.
Aww.
And we could only do that like one sheltering unit at a time.
Wow.
And then we buried her.
Sorry. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, Colette.
Hi.
How are you doing?
I'm doing fine. I just wanted to wear a mask because everybody else gets a chance and I don't.
Now there's a new perspective. I hadn't heard that before. Wow. Well, you look good. You're color coordinated as I would expect. How are you, Barbara?
I'm doing fine, thank you. Yep.
Yeah, so it's good to be back. I was looking forward to, reopening and getting back to this. I don't know. It's just been a very strange time. I'm sure it has been for all of you as well. Do you have any of you have other friends or relatives that have the virus?
Go ahead.
I have two friends from my church who have the virus. One is in Florida and one is comes to the Franklin Lakes Church. Both gentlemen, both older, both from my Bible study. So we have been praying for them.
Yeah.
We seem to be doing well in Florida in our area, although the governor is not helping. I mentioned to you the death of the Bob Miller, which George reminded me yesterday that he was an elder.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah, PCFL, probably in the 80s or 90s.
Well, I was very sad to hear. Sorry to hear about his death, and I feel like every day that goes by I prepare myself because we hear about more.
Yeah.
People that we know. The pastor of the United Church in Patterson is on event in a hospital in Patterson, and he's done better than he is right now. They had him off for a while, but they had to put him back on, and so we're praying for him. And I'm also connected to a church in Jersey City, and they've lost 3 already, from their congregation that have died. So, I don't know.
I have a friend, Ilana,
from Englewood, whose father has been in the hospital for over a month now. He was intubated, then he was extubated, then he was intubated again, and they had to invert him, turn him upside down for a while so the lungs could function. It seems now he's doing better against all odds, but she, along with her 6-month-old son and her husband, were also quarantined. They didn't have any symptoms, but they were positive.
Oh, really?
Yeah, they tested the son, the 6-month-old, because he had had close contact with his grandfather, and he had suffered from bronchitis earlier, so they thought he would be most at risk, and he tested positive. So the whole family was quarantined. But now it looks like the grandfather might be doing much better, and the rest of the family is now able to go out and about again. So kind of
Wow.
a bad for them.
Yeah, it's just also the stress of the scariness of it too. It isn't just, do you have it or don't you? It's just, it's scary. And then the risk of giving it to somebody else. So one thing I'm happy about, my dad, we had him isolated early enough, I guess, so he's doing fine, for a 93-year-old, and I don't know, the grief is wearing on him. It's also been very hard for him to have none of us be able to go there to comfort him or to be with him or him to come here. So, I don't know. It's just isolation. I've always said if you want to punish a human being, put him in isolation. Because even though some of us will say, I prefer to be alone, we don't mean this alone. So I suppose we probably should start. I could not, my mind was a fog with trying to race around with the technology. I didn't know who else we should be inviting today. I know that if we don't invite people, they get, if they're a subscriber to the channel, it comes on and they can watch what's happening. It's a pretty good picture today for the online picture. So I did invite Linda Zoroff because one time she asked me to invite her. Or did I? Yes, I did. And I don't know if you know anybody else that we should invite. I don't think Martha has the technology to come on to the Zoom. And I don't think Lorna does either. I've invited Lorna for every other conversation, but she's never logged in. So why don't we begin? We had read chapter 4, did we not?
Yes.
And so we're up to chapter 5. Would someone like to read? I'd appreciate it if you would. So it's either, I'm pretty sure unless we get Colette to have her automated reader, it's either going to be you, Debbie, or you, Barbara. So.
And for me to do that, I don't know if I can do it.
No. Yeah.
You're not ambidextrous. I'll do it. I have the contemporary English version, which is a little different, but it's call out for help. Job, call out for help and see if an angel comes. Envy and jealousy will kill a stupid fool. I have seen fools take root, but God sends a curse, suddenly uprooting them and leaving their children helpless in court. Then hungry and greedy people gobble down their crops and grab up their wealth. Our suffering isn't caused by the failure of crops, all part of life, the sparks shooting skyward. Job, if I were you, I would ask God for help. His miracles are marvelous, more than we can count. God sends showers on earth and waters the fields. He protects the sorrowful and lifts up those who have been disgraced. God swiftly traps the wicked in their own evil schemes, and their wisdom falls. Darkness is their only companion, hiding their path at noon. God rescues the needy from the words of the wicked and the fist of the mighty. The poor are filled with hope, and injustice is silenced. Consider yourself fortunate. Consider yourself fortunate if God, all-powerful, chooses to correct you. He may cause injury and pain, but he will bandage and heal your cuts and bruises. God will protect you from harm, no matter how often trouble may strike. In times of war and famine, God will keep you safe. You will be sheltered without fear of hurtful words or any other weapon. You will laugh at the threat of destruction and famine, and you won't be afraid of wild animals. They will no longer be fierce, and your rocky fields will become friendly. Your home will be secure, and your sheep will be safe. You will have more descendants than there are blades of grass on the face of the earth. You will live a long life, and your body will be strong till the day you die. Our experience has proven these things to be true. So listen and learn.
So anybody want to say anything about this comment, about this amazing claim?
I'm not sure who's speaking here. Who's speaking to Job in this section?
I think it's a continuation of Eliphaz.
Oh, okay.
Eliphaz is now, after he's finished sort of reprimanding Job, he now tells him all the rest of what he has to say now.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Doesn't he, in the end, isn't he one of the friends that turns their back on Job, though, eventually? Or is that not the case?
Yeah, I mean, yes, and I think that depending upon how you hear it, I think he's already doing it right here in this speech. I think he's already turning his back on him. I think, worse, he's turning a sharp knife toward him. The sharp knife of his tongue, disguised as words of comfort and faith. I don't know how else to say it.
Yeah, you seem to be accusing Job of some unknown sin that Job is paying for. But yeah, I don't know. With friends like these, right? You don't need enemies. Or...
Yeah, exactly. I mean,
Well,
I mean, it's an amazing claim, and it's one of those times where I, as a pastor, have to say, I don't. I said this to Laura the other day. I recognize that in my ministry as a pastor, I've never ever participated in what I call cliches. I think cliches are an abomination to a faith that is based in words, in words. And as soon as words lose their connection to what's happening, then to me we've lost what our, we're supposed to be people of the book. We're the people of the word. But the word was never intended to be cliches. It was never intended to be. And there's nothing here that you could say in these things. He says, look, God's ways are unsearchable, marvelous things. He gives rain on the earth, and he sets on high those who are lowly, and frustrates the devices of the crafty, so that... And what I hear coming through, and must feel a little bit like a kind of hand pressing down on Job is, I don't know what your problem is, Job. God will deliver here. Like God, God defends the lowly. So if you're the lowly, you got nothing to worry about. And I just,
Yeah.
like I do believe that in the arc the arc of history, that injustice has its mouth shut. but I will tell you, there's a long periods of time, and I'm not convinced that in many parts of our world today, injustice has its mouth open wide, and there's nobody shutting its mouth. And so I'm not sure how comforting it is or helpful it is for Job to be reminded that God will deliver you from your troubles. Okay.
Yeah.
But, I got leprosy all over my skin. My family's dead. There's quotes here about how you shall know that your tent is safe, and your descendants will be many, and your offspring will spring up like grass. His offspring are all dead. Like, I mean, is it me?
I have a revised standard edition, and at the top of the page where they give the little synopsis, it says Eliphaz the mystic. Are they trying to? So Eliphaz in this version has come off not as just a friend, but as a mystic who knows the mind of God.
I think so.
Not that, but I think Eliphaz is trying to help Job, but not doing such a good job. And in verse 8, he says, "As for me, I would seek God, and to God would I commit my cause." Well, if he knows Job, he knows that Job is a godly human being. So why would he assume that he hasn't done just that? The outcome is not what you expect. He's not much of a mystic, and he's not much of a friend at this point. I don't know. I think he's trying to help, but it's not helping. And I find it probably more hurtful than helpful.
Yeah, and look at, I don't know, again, I've never been so amazed. The difference between the translations, Barbara, is amazing in this. I try to figure out how could the Hebrew be so, I always know there's always a wide berth for translation, and it's not that it's different in essential meaning, but wow, the order of the words, the paragraphs, and everything are very different. I had to check several times to then know where you were, and that, to me, that often isn't the case. By the way, I've just been asked to invite Kathy Myers, so I'm going to see if I can drop down here and invite her to come on board with us. She's also sent me her email address, which I think I have, but I'm sorry for the interruption, but I want to invite her to come in. Where did she must have emailed me. Now I can't find her message. Let me see. I don't think she's saved in my... I just got a message and now I can't find it. This isn't my day for technology. All right. Where would it be? It's got to be in my email. Oh, here it is. Okay. Yep, there it is right there. Okay, we'll see if we can get her in there now then. I was saying that the difference in the volume of words and the arrangement of the words is huge in this difference. And yours, it's just this contemporary English version, right, Barbara?
She's muted.
Oh.
Barbara, unmute yourself.
Now you're.
Getting scratchy noises, and I was trying. Okay, I was curious as to whether verses 6 and 7, mine is, our suffering isn't caused by the failure of crops. It's all part of life.
Yeah.
Now, that seems very different than the rest of what he's talking about with, things happen to people, to bad people. But with this, he's pretty much saying this could happen to anyone.
Yeah, and there's some of that logic is developed down where it says, "Happy is the one whom God reproves. Therefore, do not despise the discipline of the Almighty, for He wounds, but He binds up; He strikes, but His hands heal." I feel like, he's just treading into some. And again, I'm going to say this: it may just be me. I have never appreciated people who come beside me and say, well, God brings these things into your life so that, you can become stronger, and perseverance. The Apostle Paul says, some sequence of like hardship comes so that then we develop, discipline, and then the discipline leads to perseverance, and the perseverance. Like, I don't doubt that any of that is true, but don't come at me with that when I've got leprosy. I just, is it just me?
No, it's not you. The message in Islam from a lot of the scholars are the same. It's the same idea that Paul says, from adversity comes strength. If you're tested by God, it's don't be upset by it because He loves you. It's like when a parent says, this is going to hurt me more than it hurts you. Well, yeah. I don't know. That's what it always reminded me of. I guess, in the end, if you come out alive, you probably are made stronger by adversity. But it is kind of cruel to say that to someone who's going through that at the moment. It's just not comforting.
No. Hi, Kathy. Hi. Welcome. Sorry.
Thank you.
Sorry, it took a while.
I'm on YouTube, and now I can actually communicate.
Good. I'm glad. Anybody else that's on YouTube, if you want to join in the conversation, just do what Kathy did. Just send me an email or a text, and we'll welcome you into the conversation.
This reminds me also of Catholicism with martyrs, and the worse things that happened to the person, the holier they became, because they had suffered so much for God. And this is what they're talking about is, God wants you to suffer, like to me, that, you become holier, you become better because of your suffering.
And I've often, as I try to explain to people my reaction, sometimes I'm just very quiet when I get hit with these cliches and people say these things to me. Well, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, and all those things. In some level, I go, okay, but do not come to me with this as your response to my suffering. It doesn't work for me. It doesn't work for me, and I can tell you, even people who thought it worked for others and have used this kind of approach to others, when they're the one lying in the hospital bed, or they're the ones whose child is dying, or they're the one who's facing, homelessness or whatever, they don't appreciate it when it's directed to them. Because in the end, it's no comfort. It is no comfort. Does God discipline us? Yes. Yes, life has its built-in disciplines. There's no question. Does adversity make us stronger? Sometimes. Sometimes adversity just crushes us. And sometimes we rise above it. But I think you have to be very careful when you start rolling out the God statements at that time. I don't know. I'd say I get kind of tongue-tied because I've come into Christianity through, and have been nurtured in Christianity through a kind of a way of explaining God and how God works in the world. But I've always felt like I stand on the margins because there's so much of what is mainstream in the theology of Christians, and they're dealing with suffering. I don't accept it. I don't accept it. And I feel like here I'm given license to say I don't accept it because this friend of Job's, this Eliphaz, the mystic, is his story is being printed and revealed so that you can see through it, so that you will not adopt this, so that you will never do this to a friend, to someone who is seeking comfort from someone who believes in God, someone who puts their trust in God. And I don't know. I can keep talking, but I'd like to hear what you think about it.
Well, what do you find the best to when someone is having difficulties and doesn't understand? Is it to listen to them, to just acknowledge that they have a problem and not try to come up with an answer?
Yeah, I would say yes. That is. I know they say a good theology has to begin with a good study of humans. In other words, you have to know or have an idea about what is helpful to humans. And in my pastoral work and in my experience, I've tried to say over and over again, to me, the incarnation of God in Jesus Christ coming into the world, walking a mile in our shoes, standing beside us. Yes, there were a few people that he fixed along the way, but basically his dying on the cross was an act of solidarity. He stood with us. The worst thing you can do to a human being is to isolate them. The best thing that you could ever do to any human being who is struggling is to stand with them. Be with them. Support them. I think most people will tell you that except on very rare occasions, does a person who comes alongside them with a word of wisdom or, remember, God is good and tomorrow will be better and all those, and again, I throw all that stuff into what I call cliches. Cliches are what you say when you don't know what else to say. and when you don't know what else to say, the best thing to do is to be quiet. It's to be quiet. Let the quietness of your presence be profound in that person's life. And then, if you know them well enough, draw them out in terms of what are you thinking and what are you feeling. No judgment. Just, I'm here, talk to me. Tell me what you're thinking. I was talking to someone yesterday, and I get in this place, and I think, why am I a pastor? I don't know why I'm a pastor, because I'm talking on the phone to someone whose dear friend has died, and didn't die of the coronavirus, but died because the hospital couldn't take their friend into the hospital and treat them. They had a major surgery. They had complications after the major surgery, and they were not able to go back even to a doctor, and they died from preventable consequences. Now, this person is on the phone talking to me, and they say, always there's an apology. People apologize when they tell the truth to a pastor, which I think is really interesting. And they say, Pastor Lou, I'm really sorry, but I got to say what's on my mind. And then I go, okay, I have to stop and go, okay, stop wondering why people are apologizing for saying what's on their mind. But then she gets right to it and she says, I am furious with God. I am furious with God, and I know I shouldn't be. So I will keep my mouth shut. And what do? This is why I say, I go, say some more about that. Say some more. Talk to me some more. Because every page I read in this Bible in front of me, every person who is a follower of God does not apologize for opening their mouth and saying exactly what you would to any other person in a relationship that you trust. Just because you say it doesn't mean you're right. But you're right about how you feel. You're right, she said, and then she got started. and she got on a roll of how unfair and unjust. And she's weeping so much that she can hardly talk. And what I do is I feel like I'm the catcher at the pitcher's pitching the pitch. I'm the catcher. My job is to be there to catch it and to say, come on, you gotta come with this. This is the truth. It's the truth. And it may not be the truth about the universe, but it's the truth about where you're at. It's the truth about how you feel. And then sometimes if they're interested, I'll even say, I feel the same way you do listening to you describe it. And aren't we in a holy mess? Because here we are over here, both of us, little peon human beings. We don't hold the stars in the sky or spin the earth we don't do any of that, but we're mad at God. Look at us. And what do I think? I think it's the healthiest thing you can do. Laura sometimes will tell people that, her friends in New York City and our friends, a lot of people are not church people today. And they'll say to us, wow. They'll say to Laura, your husband's a pastor? And she'll say, yeah. And here's what she follows it usually with. It's the church of mental health. Because if you aren't willing to commit to a truthiness about your life and about the circumstances of your life, then my own feeling is the promise and the presence of the gospel will have no impact on your life. Because you've put up a bubble of cliche of I don't know. So that was a long answer to your question, Barbara, but that's where I come from.
Yep.
And then
Mark did not want to give answers, though. To find a solution, or you want to help that person, and you keep thinking that means I have to have these solutions for that person, and not think that, well, all I need to do is be quiet and sit there and listen. And that's very difficult.
It is. I had a great chaplain supervisor when I did my year-long internship in the hospital. And one of the things he taught us, and I didn't come to this on my own. I came to it because I was taught about the impact of this way of relating to people. He taught us that if we were willing to listen carefully, that when you enter a hospital room and you're the chaplain, and you're really willing to listen honestly, people will invite you to leave. They will. And when they will invite you to leave is when you start giving advice. And it's tricky because, you don't pick up on it right away. You don't. You go in and you go, a person, I remember one guy I was talking to who he had black lung. He had black lung disease. He was one of my first patients that as a chaplain I had to go in and visit. And he was pretty clear that he was gonna die. Not right away. But he had been in a lot of pain, and so I go in and I'm with him. And I am immediately aware of how uncomfortable I am. how amazingly uncomfortable I am to be in the presence of somebody who is in that situation. So what do? I start talking. I just, well, and usually with me it begins with the word well, and that word alone is dismissive.
Right, right.
It's just it's a dismissive interlude. Well, you do remember that God loves you, right? Or I don't know. I can't even remember. It was so hard to come up with some cliche to say, and it wasn't very long. He couldn't really talk all that well, but in his pain, he didn't have to stand on a lot of like pretense. And I'd only been in there a couple of minutes, and he looked up at me, looked me right in the eye, and said, I'm really kind of tired. Now, also, and I will tell you this just for full disclosure, so I immediately realized I was being dismissed. And then I come up with the idea that, well, he said that, but he doesn't really want me to leave. So I go back for another dip. I go back in and go, yeah, but you really need to hear the good news and the confidence and the faith, right, that I'm bringing. And so what does he do? After I can't remember what I said, but I remember the dynamic of it because I had to write about it afterwards, that having not listened to what he said, he then closed his eyes and turned his head over to his pillow. Now, in order for me to be helpful, this is the group, what we did was you had a situation like that, and then you had to write about the experience, and then you went back, and there were 8 other people there to pick you apart for what you'd done. It was great training. But what you learn is you start to imagine, how would that have been different if I had dealt with how uncomfortable I was? And how really frightening it was to be in the room. I had already by that point been around people who had died. I'd experienced death and more than my own life. But to be in that transition place is really uncomfortable. Especially when you have a name tag on that says I'm the chaplain, and I hear I'm representing some version of the ecumenical church. How different it would have been. The me that would walk in a room today is an entirely different me. I can walk in and sit down next to the bed of a person who I know is in pain and is dying, and I can sit patiently and quietly. Maybe I'll see if they want me to hold their hand. I can do it because I have dealt with at least knowing how uncomfortable I can become in that situation. And
how much of that is from what you've learned about yourself?
Yes, it is. It is. It's absolutely. And people, I said this a couple of times before, but Socrates said, above all else, know yourself. Because until you know yourself, you can't really measure the ripples in the pond where you live. You can't really see what effect you're having. Your good intentions, like this Eliezer, I don't doubt that he had great intentions. But, that's why they made that other cliche, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And it is the road to hell. And so in pastoral care training, the chaplaincy, the whole thrust of that entire year, you can't fix yourself. That's not the point. It's not therapy, but it is know yourself. Know yourself, and know that if this thought comes to mind in this situation with this friend, which says, well, God disciplines people all the time, Joe. You should just look for the lesson.
In the Grace Church where we came from, they have a Stephen ministry, and they had asked me to be a Stephen minister. And I have a lot of psych experience because I worked for Dr. Galena for 15 years. And I have had a lot of experience because my dad was a minister, and, you know, we had everybody over at our house, just stopping in at like 10 o'clock at night with a crisis or whatever. And I told them I couldn't be a Stephen minister because I have information that sometimes I think it's important to relate. Like, we had a patient, or actually she was a patient of mine, and she was also a friend of mine and also a member of the church. And during the church service, they came and grabbed me because she was suicidal, and her son had brought her to church because he didn't know where else to bring her. So of course they called me out of church. And, you know, of course I sat, I listened, I did everything that I was supposed to do, and I learned in my psych experience. But I don't do good just sitting back and letting people talk. I do well saying, okay, I hear you, I know what you've got, I know the problem. Here are some resources that you can use to take. I'm not going to take them for you, but if you choose to take this may give you some help. And that's not what you're supposed to do as a Stephen minister. You're just supposed to sit there and listen. I don't do that.
Yeah, and that is really important distinction, because, you know, if you're a doctor and you enter a room, or you're a nurse and you enter a room and you just stand there listening to people, you're going to get fired. Like, that's not your job. It is not your job. And what's interesting is, in our training, part of our training was that when we would get into our encounter groups, we would start to pretend that we were nurses or doctors. In other words, we'd start to give patients advice. We would say, well, you know, my relative had this, and when they had this, they took this. And man, you want to see someone get disciplined. You want to see how you get disciplined by the floor, the nurse that's in charge of the floor. If she gets word that you as a pastor have entered the room and you are giving advice to the patient, you're out. You're
the problem
out.
is I am a nurse, and that's what I do.
I understand that.
To stop that, it doesn't work. And so where do you stand in regards to something like we're reading about in Job, where you're supposed to listen and, you know, be their support system? I can't just be a support system. I need to tell you, this is how you can help yourself. And is that wrong? No,
I don't think that's wrong at all. Imagine, though, if this friend Eliezer of Job's, there's nothing wrong if you know what you're talking about and you're trained and you're a medical person, giving people information about what will make them feel better. I mean, Eliezer didn't come with a jar of salve and say, listen, Eliezer, you have sores on your skin. Would you trust me enough to let me rub this salve on your wounds? And then Job could have said, well, yeah, what do you know about this? And and Eliezer could have said, look, I've been practicing these sort of organic arts for years, and they're very helpful. And then, there's nothing wrong with that at all. It's that Eliezer has crossed over. He's gone into the realm of meaning and purpose and why. Why? I mean, as a nurse, what do you do when someone asks you, why is this happening to me?
More or less, it is what it is, and deal. And that's not a good answer, but it is what it is. It's not God's will. It's not because you were a bad person. It is what it is, and this is life and death.
And I have, with all the respect I have for the fact that I'm not a medical person, I have to tell you how many times I go into a room as a chaplain, I'm there, and then the nurse comes in or the assistant comes in, and recognizes that I'm pastor, and then the nurse begins to be the preacher and the teacher and starts to offer, well, the license to do it is here because the pastor's in the room, and all of a sudden all the spiritual cliches come out, and I go, you know what? What's that phrase? Stay in your lane. Just stay in your lane. Because they didn't teach you that in medical school. They didn't teach you that in nurses' school. Because if you really want to help a person, if you really want to have that whole person to the whole helping to the whole person, you got to get some training in the other side of this too.
Well, I guess it's kind of like the pastor stays in his lane, the friend stays in his lane, the nurse stays in his lane, and don't try to intermingle because we're not capable. We're not trained.
Right.
I think one of the words Kathy used that is important is a resource. To be there for someone as a resource if that person says,
I want to.
Where should I go? What can I do? Kind of thing. But not saying, well, this is what you need to do. But as you said, these are possible resources you might want to consider if they ask. And I think that's part of it too, is waiting to be asked. And that's not always easy. That's for sure.
And I think you can develop a relationship with someone, even if you're a doctor or a nurse or a pastor. You can develop a relationship with a person where they recognize that you're going to ask them, is it okay? Like you say, do you want me to tell you something that, I learned? You ask permission. You ask. And to go back to your comment, Kathy, about the Stevens ministry, in the Bound Brook Church, it was a big church, and we had a lot of retired people who were still very active. And so one of the things they decided was they were going to put together a Stevens ministry type thing, and there were 15 people in the ministry, and they all wanted to go out and do this thing of having a little badge and going and make some visits. But quite honestly, I had to stop it. I had to stop it because it was doing more harm than it was good. It's not helpful. If you're not going to, we would have a training once a month. And I would try to do lessons like what I've been talking about right here. And, most people were like, well, it was especially hard for them to do when they already knew the person. They have a relationship with the person. So they walk in their house and they say, I'm here as a Stevens minister. And you couldn't get down to anything about how they were really feeling or what was really going on. And so really what it became was a kind of a social club.
Exactly.
And it never really, in the end, if someone really wanted someone that would have some laser focus to be able to go and visit and listen to how the person is feeling and really become a Stevens minister, mostly people were not willing to go through that kind of training. They didn't want to do that. They just wanted to do something nice for somebody. And so
There's probably nothing wrong with being sociable at someone's time of need, but I think in this story, Eliphaz is trying to interpret the mind of God to Job, and who knows the mind of God?
Exactly.
It's up to Job to discover that for himself, or what he thinks might be going on. Eliphaz is not helpful at this point, as I'm sure you probably, as you said, learned that you can't interpret what God means to the person who's in pain because you don't know. People often don't want to hear you say, I don't know exactly how to help you, but sometimes that's the truth. Just to be there, I think, helps sometimes, but sometimes it doesn't. Each person is different, and, well, this does not work for Job. Yeah.
no, and I can understand why it wouldn't. The person that came to visit him doesn't really understand the calamity that he's facing, hasn't really paid attention. Like the promise, like I love what you said. You don't know the mind of God. You don't admit that. Stop pretending it. You don't know the mind of God. We're the readers in this in this narrative, we've been given the God's eye view. We do know the mind of God. We know because the narrator told us that Job is not going to die. But Eliphaz doesn't know that. He's making, I almost said he's making shit up. I shouldn't say. But he is. He's making stuff up. He's making stuff up in order to what? And oftentimes people make stuff up to make themselves feel better. And isn't that a reverse thing? You go to visit someone to make them feel better, and you end up saying what makes you feel better. It's just as natural as can be, and certainly Eliphaz is not alone in the world.
And then he can go back and say, well, I saw Job and I told him that this is that, and made himself feel better because he had done that versus making Job feel better about anything.
Exactly. I mean, I like the words you say, making him feel better. I think that the scary thing about us human beings is you can't make anybody feel anything. But you can create a situation in which the person may come to feel better. And that goes back to Barbara's original question to me, which is, in my understanding of human beings, what creates an environment where people will actually feel better is if they're not alone. And if they are understood. And if someone is able to hear the intensity of their pain or their grief or their loss. I don't know why it is, but studies show that pathway is the one pathway in which a person might actually feel better. The rest of it, like, I've not really ever had, I hope I can say this all without getting, emotional myself. I've never had the kind of shower of cards from people in a grief like I have had with the death of my mother. Cards, not, and this isn't the age of cards anymore. This isn't where people take pen to paper anymore, and I respect that. I'm not complaining, but oh my goodness. And yet what I have to tell you is, what I observe is that what the card says is often not that helpful, but the card itself is overwhelming. Because when the card arrives, it says, I'm aware that you're in a bad state. That's what the card arriving says. The rest of it, it's not bad or good or any of the rest of it. I'm just saying that for me, the cards arriving, I don't know anything really about sitting Shiva in the Jewish faith, and I don't know what the equivalent in the Muslim faith is, but in the environment that I am living in, to go to the mailbox and receive the cards it's wampum. Like, it's money, it's power, it's strength. And that's before I open the card.
You know the old cliche, it's the thought that counts.
It is.
And that's truly what it is. It is the thought. Not necessarily the words, but the thought.
And
I think when my friends are sitting Shiva, and I've gone to a lot of people's homes during that time, sometimes there's a lot of conversation, but often there's no conversation at all. People just sit. They're just there for one another. And in the mosque, when somebody dies, oftentimes if it's going to be a big crowd, they'll hold a time for the families to get together in the mosque. There's just chairs around in a big circle, and sometimes somebody will read from Quran, but mostly people just come to just sit with the family And oftentimes they don't say anything at all,
Right.
besides a passing, "I'm very sorry for your loss," and that's it. But just knowing, looking around and knowing that your community is there when you're in pain does a lot to alleviate that pain, I think. And it really is helpful. It's the same idea as the cards. We're with you.
Yep.
We know you're in pain, and we don't want you to forget that you have community with you.
Exactly.
Time.
Exactly. I mean, it.
When people sit around at a wake, you walk in there, you do your handshakes, and then you sit.
Right.
And you sit.
Mm-hmm.
And that's all you do. Or maybe remember, or share a fun time or something.
And the sitting, when the words are done, and you turn around and you go back and you find your place to sit in the funeral home or in the church or wherever, and you sit. It's in the sitting that the healing ointment is being applied. It's in that witness. It's that showing upness, and the silence. The silence is, we often think of silence is like, oh, I didn't have anything to say. Okay. Then that might be just the time to stay. Because the silence this is where I become a mystic. This is where I am willing to talk about the limits of our understanding, of how we really communicate with each other. That our communications are not limited to our words, not by a long shot. I'm remembering what I would say was probably one of the most influential experiences in my young life as a pastor. I served as a volunteer for the hospital in the community. And I was young, and pastors took turns in the neighborhood being on call. And so I got called in to a crisis. It was a car crash. There was a teenager who had been nearly mortally wounded, was hanging on the edge of life. And then there was an older man. And I forget all of it, but somehow the person who ran into the other person, they were both related. And so in the hospital, it was just chaos. They were both large families, and they all knew each other. And I got called in at about 6 o'clock in the morning on a Saturday morning. And I didn't know any of these people. I introduced myself when I walked in, and they had so much to say to each other. There was arguing that went on. There was weeping. I've never heard such weeping in my life, especially when the doctors came out to tell them that the boy had died. And the weeping, it spilled out of the waiting room into the hallway and all. You know what I was doing? I was sitting in the corner. Just sitting there. I have never felt so helpless in all my life. I just sat. And I sat for 12 hours. For 12 hours I sat in the room. Now, sometimes if a new person joined in the mayhem, someone would say, oh, that's Reverend Kilgore sitting in the corner over there. And I would go, hello. I sat. And at the end of 12 hours, when the hospital finally said to them, it's really time to leave, and they knew it was time to leave, and I got up and I walked out with them, and on the ride home, I just kept thinking, I was of absolutely no help. I did nothing. I did nothing. Now, what I'm going to tell you is, in the weeks that followed, my sitting still and being quiet in that room, I got more people calling me, and from that family thanking me for what I had done to help them during that time. Now, you figure that out. I was embarrassed. I felt like, oh, I should have at least done this, or I should have at least done this, or It was 12 hours. I mean, I would get up and go to the bathroom, or I would go get a snack and ask if somebody, do you want anything? Mostly they didn't. They were taking care of themselves, and I'd come back and took my post in that chair and just sat as a silent presence in the worst chaos of their lives. And yet, from what they said in the weeks and even the months, the letters, they went to the effort of finding out from the hospital how to write to me. The letters that arrived, somehow my presence in that room was a comfort of knowing that God was with them. It didn't feel that way to me. What? Go ahead. What?
And he was with them. You were there. You were instrumental. Even though you felt like you did nothing, you did something huge.
Yeah, and I have since learned then to think that, it's not even just about me. It's that when people find out you're a pastor, you don't just represent yourself, you represent the faith community is present with you. Like, it's bigger than me. That's why I don't have to say anything. Once they know who I am and who sent me there, it has an inexplainable but understandable effect. That we are not alone. The walls are caving in, chaos is happening, our family is falling apart, but in the middle of it, we have this reminder that God's arms are somehow the bookends around this, and that we have this room to move around in the middle of this chaos. Those experiences they're formative in my life as a pastor. And I don't know, I know a lot of pastors that my senior pastor in the Ewing Church hated visiting people. He hated it. We were good friends. And so I was in charge of visitation. I was the associate pastor, so I'd go out and do a visitation. And then I would call him and I would say, listen, I think this person's not doing well. You ought to pay a visit yourself. And sometimes he would come in when I was there. It was the worst experience you'd ever want, because he would walk in. He's a great preacher, a great minister, but he would walk in the room and you could just tell he walked down the halls of the hospital and start wrapping himself in his arms. He hated being in the hospital. He hated it. He'd walk in the room. He'd walk over. He'd look at me. He'd look at the person in the bed. And immediately he would say, let's pray. And then he would say a prayer. And when he was finished saying a prayer, he'd look at me, he'd look at the person and go, well, I'm really glad I got to visit you. He was out of the room. He hated it.
That's the difference between a minister and a pastor. Because a minister can preach, but a pastor has a flock.
Yeah. Yeah, and there's, I've talked about the kind of a culture of what I call tall steeple pastors. Presbyterian pastors wear academic robes. The black robe and the marking on the robe is an academic robe. That's a Presbyterian tradition, because Presbyterian pastors were academics. And they were to have offices with lots of books. But the role of the pastor, the preacher, was an academic role. Scholars, that's we were generated to be, but we were not cultured in, I think you used the word difference between, what do you say, minister and a pastor? Yeah, we were not cultured in that difference. Now, I came out of a different tradition. I came out of the Pentecostal Anabaptist tradition, and so I had a different orientation. I can do the academic work. I love the academic work, but I didn't go to Princeton Seminary because I wanted to be a pastor among people. I wanted to be out among people. So I went to Philadelphia and ministered and was taught pastoral care as the preeminent part of my work. And that's just better for me. I don't mean it as a criticism. We need the scholars and the academics as well. There's one more thing I thought of when I was reading through this text earlier. I saw there. I've said this phrase before. I'll keep saying it. In the middle of crisis, in the middle of especially big events, everybody becomes a theologian. And boy, it's happening now. Have you heard it? You know, everybody's out there with their theology, and everybody's dusting off their theologies. But the one that I can't help it, I know I should stay away from trying to criticize other pastors, but there's one of these big televangelists who got his soldiers from his church together, and they got in front of the television camera, and he prayed a prayer and commanded the virus to go away.
I saw that. And did he blow it away?
He did. He blew it away.
Right.
He went.
I saw that. He looked like he was insane. And it sounded insane.
It sounded insane. It sounded crazy. And so when craziness can be passed off as a spiritual giant, some of my friends used to say, "Oh, the spiritual giants in the world." You got to be able to distinguish between giant-sized faith and insanity. It's just, and I feel like some of that is here in this good old friend of Eliphaz, as he says, you know, you guys have to take up the right point of view, and God will eliminate from your life every illness, every disease, anything that would scare you. And he makes this claim: you're gonna come to your grave in ripe old age.
How do you know?
That's faith, man. That's faith. And I don't think that's faith at all. I just have to say, that's not me. You get in trouble, you're not going to get that kind of advice with me as a pastor. You're not. And maybe you'll be one to go, well, what good is he? Just sits in the corner. You know, he doesn't do anything. So when my kids heard that I was going to school to get my doctorate, one of their friends was over at the house, and they were sitting at the kitchen table, and they said, well, what kind of doctor is your dad going to be? And my daughter said, the kind that doesn't do anything. She reminds me of that every now and then. You know? So. All right. Well, unless you have other questions or comments, I think we kind of wrapped it up for today, have we not?
Yes.
It's very good to be with you. I am living into a huge part of my life of missing the people like you, missing seeing you. Even, you know, Zoom is fine. It's better than nothing. But it's a poor substitute for seeing each other and being in the presence of each other. So I'm holding on to and praying for the day where that will be the case.
This tomorrow night begins Ramadan for our community at sundown. And so the first full day of fasting is Friday, but the first night of prayers is tomorrow night. And that is something that is done communally. There are always so many people in the mosque, and now everybody's going to be sitting at home. It'll be a new experience, but we'll see. But I think everybody's really feeling that loss of community,
Yeah.
being able to be with people and touch them and speak face to face. So
Yeah.
I get what you're saying. So we'll see. It's going to be a weird month for fasting and praying, but we'll get through it.
Yeah, and today is Earth Day.
Yes.
So it's a day to try to be more aware of our presence, not only to each other because they were absent, but also to be aware of our presence on this planet, and to think about and to wonder about what effect do we have. I don't know. I've always loved Earth Day. I've loved it from the first day they came up with it, and I hope that it's been some help as people try to think more about we make an impact. We have an impact. If we're willing to isolate, it has an impact. If we're willing to do things like recycle or live differently, it has an impact in the world. Little things lead to massive things. So, all right.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Nice to see you all. God bless you.
Take care.
Bye-bye.